SwitchUp has always been about bringing those hidden gems and those less known titles to your attention, and LUMO was a game that you loved when it first came out back in the day.
Yeah, LUMO was a real love letter to the kind of isometric puzzle games of the Spectrum era, and it gained a bit of a cult following when it released what should be about 10 years ago by now, which is crazy really.
Wow.
So LUMO 2 takes that formula and it moves it on a bit with a few added bits of herbs and spices.
Indeed, yeah, it does. The guy's gone a next level, I think, in bringing back those retro classic feels to his new game. And as this is a sponsored video to show you exactly what it entails, we will have a copy or two to give away. Just let us know down in the comments, maybe your favorite retro classic.
So what exactly is LUMO 2? Well, let's find out. In terms of story, there's not a huge amount that's explicit, but you are basically almost sucked into a retro game at the start, end up donning a wizard's hat, and then need to make your way through a number of different puzzled rooms to try and escape.
That then places you at the start of the game, where you have the option of 3 different closed-off areas. One of them opens up, and then you begin by entering a quite obscure space.
Yeah, now I mentioned at the start that the first LUMO game was almost exclusively isometric. This one, I would say for the most part, still is, but it does have a number of different almost gameplay genres or ways of playing at the very least spliced in, and you'll see some of these quite early on. So for example, very early on then, you find yourself in a 2D perspective in almost like a mini game that reminded me of something like Impossible Mission from back in the day, where you're navigating different lifts and trying to get to the top of the stage, and all of this is so that you can move on to the next part, unlocking more of those isometric rooms.
Yeah, and it carries over the hallmark of some of those older titles in that it doesn't hold your hand at all. You will enter some spaces and be like, what's happening here? You know, what do I have to do? But it soon becomes quite apparent, and as Glenn said, it's split into those 2 areas. It has that classic isometric LUMO style, and then it has those 3 different mini-game experiences.
Yeah, so the isometric parts, they play very much like something like Night Law from back in the day, from Ultimate Play the Game. I would be surprised if that wasn't a major influence in this game, certainly in the first game. And as Mark said, there are areas that you'll go in and you'll be quite perplexed to start with as to what it is you have to do. There'll be perhaps buttons on the floor or some sort of object that you need to interact with, and it is trial and error to a degree to try and solve the puzzle, but never to the point where you're completely lost. You just need to have a bit of strategic thinking going on.
Every single game or area has a hidden item. I mean, that's standard, isn't it, of the old classics. In this case, it's a little duck that you have to then retrieve and try and make your way back to the start.
Yeah, as well as the ducks, there are cassette tapes to try and find too. So on top of the time you'll take, obviously, finishing the game, you do have those collectibles to go back for if you want a bit more once the credits have rolled.
So let's talk about perhaps one of the most interesting mini games that we saw, and that was the Space Harrier type experience.
Yeah, so Space Harrier was a classic game from Sega, an arcade game back in the day, and there is, as Mark said, a game here that replicates that in terms of you being behind your character, moving forwards, that kind of faux 3D going on, having to shoot a bunch of things that are coming towards you. In this case, it's a lot of like Atari joysticks, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. The other mini game reminded me of one we played that was called Hyper Sentinel, and then I think you really enjoyed the original version of that.
Yeah, so Hyper Sentinel came out a few years back, but it itself was based on a classic game from, well, I played it on the Commodore at least, called Uridium, which is a top-down shooter where you're in a spaceship and you're moving from left to right, but you're kind of having to do almost like quick turns, quick 180 turns to fly back the other way and shoot all of the turrets on this huge ship. And there is a minigame here that again just replicates the feel of that classic game.
So the isometric classic style sections get progressively more challenging. We had one where the world's literally falling away and I was dying over and over again. You seem to just pick it up and get it. I think that's like your arcade game experience.
Yeah, so there'll be an exit at somewhere in the level at some point in that particular screen, I should say, more so than level. Sometimes it's relatively straightforward in terms of moving horizontally, but you do have that verticality to some stages too, with the added dangers of crumbling blocks and what have you. And at times I say at times, the majority of the time you will be fighting the perspective.
Yeah.
But again, that's very intentional with these isometric puzzlers.
It also did throw in a few more modern references as well. So while you have those isometric stages, it started to bring in elements of some games like Monument Valley. There's one where you have to rotate the whole world. That was very cool.
Yeah, it was nice how they did that actually. Obviously, it's a huge love letter to classic games. In ones we haven't really mentioned, things like Dizzy, characters like that are referenced. But when it does mix in that modern take too and does things that the classic games couldn't have done, I think that's probably when it's at its best.
If you're coming at this completely fresh, you may wonder how things like death and lives work. There's no lives per se, and you can die repeatedly. It will just send you to the start of an area. It's, as Glenn said at the start, that trial and error takes place.
It will also save any collectibles that you get if you do die within a room. So that does alleviate some of the frustration of, you know, going out of your way to collect one and then dying. You'll keep that saved. And then from that point on, it's just about getting through that puzzle.
You do gain new abilities and powers as you progress. You gain a staff that lets you see invisible blocks in the world and like a double jump.
Let's move on to the visuals then, and as we've mentioned a few times now, it does go for that retro style. It very much harkens back to the days of home computers. I mentioned the Spectrum, of course, and that kind of undeniably British time in the history of video gaming. And the main character reminds me a bit of like Orko from He-Man as well, you know?
Yeah, it drip feeds the language of those old systems into its UIs as well. You'll see the Spectrum colors down at the bottom of the screen and the lower thirds and things like that. I do like that.
Yeah, also because it mixes up its gameplay styles, it does have a more modern look than its predecessor, but has the ability to switch back to that classic look at times too. I mean, the Space Harrier level that we mentioned is a good example of that. It never goes full Space Harrier in terms of exactly how it looks, but it does enough to give you the feel of what it is at that moment in time it's trying to be.
The soundtrack was really nice. That's one thing I do remember. Very relaxing, very in keeping as well, and then obviously switched up depending on what minigame you were playing.
Let's move on to value then, and LUMO 2 will cost you £19.99, or of course your regional equivalent. However, it does currently have 20% available off of that price, which goes up all the way until the end of October.
Yeah, it's one of those where I guess you're supporting something that we don't see very often these days, in that it's a dev creating a love letter of sorts to those games that many of us grew up with, but in a way that is quite unique.
So there we have it, that's LUMO 2 in a nutshell. If you have any sort of love for the 80s in terms of video gaming, certainly the home computer era, you're going to find a lot here that makes you smile.
Yeah, a big thank you to the publisher for sponsoring us. As we said, we want to give away a couple of copies. We are quite interested actually to see what games that you mentioned, because I'm sure there are some references that we wouldn't have got that you played. So yeah, let us know down in the comments your favorite classic and we'll give a couple of copies away.
What would you go for? What would be your classic kind of 80s game, maybe from the home computer era?
It would be It Came From the Desert.
Okay, yeah, the point and click game.
Good game.
Mine, it would be a toss-up between Slice By, Midnight Resistance, or APB.
Nice. What's APB?
All Points Bulletin. It was like a top-down police sim. You were chasing criminals on the road and stuff. You had to get them to confess to crimes and stuff. Yeah, it was a good game. Thank you to our patrons and our channel members for your continued support, and to each and every one of you for watching our videos. Take care, and until next time, happy gaming.